it is introducing this idea that we should take political issues out of our political system and push them through the corporation. Most Americans do not want this. It's harmful to all of us when all of our our lives we're surrounded by politics. We want to go to business and work together to achieve outcomes that improve society. And we've seen this attack on capitalism and our free enterprise system for decades. It's just that ESG really took it to the next level. And when the Biden administration came in, it was sort of a green light to the activists.
I'm Carson Jorgensen. And this is the Carson Jorgensen Podcast. Hey everybody, today's episode is brought to you in part by Crofter Market. Visit crofter.com for more information on how you can buy local food, support independent producers, and help push back against the fight on globalization of agriculture. Again, that's crofter.com for more information. Today I have a dear friend and a special guest on. He's the treasurer of the state of Utah. I knew him before he was the treasurer of the state of Utah. But Marlo Oaks. Marlo, thanks for joining me here today, and I'm glad to have you on.
It's great to be on, Carson. Thank you.
Now, you've done some amazing things. It's funny, usually state treasurers within the states, they tend to not get as much notoriety as you. It's usually a quiet and boring job, but over the last couple of years, and we've seen you all over the country, we've seen you on Tucker Carlson, he did full special on there. Why have you found yourself in that position that most other treasurers never usually do?
Well, I think it's really a function of the times in which we're living. When the Biden administration came in, we saw things being pushed in the markets, really kind of where the treasurers operate, that haven't been pushed before. And so where our capital markets and our investment markets have typically been apolitical, we saw the politicization of the markets. And so that really required the treasurers to step up. And because of my background in the markets, that really, a lot of the I guess, talking about the issues and the terminology kind of fell onto me to explain some of these things so that people could understand. So it really is kind of a function of the times in which we live and my background professionally.
Yeah, no, and so for those of you who don't know, because I find it far too easy to always tell people what I know, and I assume that everybody else knows what I'm talking about or who I'm talking about. Why don't you give people a little bit of background on you as to where you came from and why your experience is so much different than that of other treasurers across the country?
Sure. Yeah. So I spent most of my career in the financial markets, whether it was in investment management, helping to oversee investment portfolios, large institutional investment portfolios, or actually started in the banking sector in Hong Kong, of all places. I served a mission in Hong Kong, and then also spent some time in the investment banking world, so helping to raise capital. And so when the treasurer position opened up, I actually knew the deputy treasurer because he and I worked together in the private sector, and my wife and I called him to see how we could help him with this campaign, and he just mentioned he wasn't going to be running, and suggested that I should run. And I have never had political aspirations, and so I, initially rejected it out of hand, but then I started looking at the job and what it entailed, and it really aligned with my background incredibly well, including sort of the financial education piece. So the treasurer's office really is involved not just with raising money when the state needs to borrow money or managing money for different entities around the state, but there's also a financial literacy component and I had done quite a bit of philanthropic work in education, just as kind of a personal passion of mine. And so all of these things are embodied in the treasurer's office. And so when I looked at that, I thought, that's a really interesting match with my background. And then I looked to see who was running, and most folks didn't have nearly the background that I thought would be helpful, as a treasurer. And so that's when I felt like I really should step forward and put my name in the hat.
No, and I'm glad you did. And that was so for those who don't remember, don't know, or hadn't been around at the time, that was my first state central committee as chairman of the Utah Republican Party. So I was elected chairman of the Utah Republican Party, the youngest chairman ever. And I was really new to it, didn't really know. And then this race comes up, and at our first state central committee meeting, we had to hold this election. And that was one of my crowning achievements is when you got elected, because not that I had anything to do with it, but I still claim it because it's been a win, because you've been such a great help to the country and the things you've done, not just within the state, and you normally don't see that. And so again, when you really stepped onto the stage, I feel like was the rise of ESG. ESG seemed to be the huge topic at the time. And ESG, in my opinion, things like ESG and natural asset resources, we'll talk about those in a bit, but those are the biggest threat to our country. And those are the biggest threats to our freedom right now. And it's unfortunate, but people don't actually realize what's happening out there. So why don't you lay out ESG? Because most people don't understand what ESG is and actually does. And you've met with some global leaders and talked about ESG and to push back on that, because ESG is dangerous. So what is ESG for those who don't know?
Yeah, and so what we're seeing is the politicization of everything in the United States, and that includes in our capital markets. And ESG is really the politicization of our capital markets, because a corporation was set up to serve its owners. As the owners of a business, those owners are taking a lot of risk, and they get paid last after all other stakeholders are paid. And ESG tries to push, it's also another name is stakeholder capitalism, and it seeks to replace shareholder capitalism, where a corporation's purpose is to serve the shareholders, because they're the owners, they're putting up the capital in the company, they're putting their money at risk, and so they expect a return. Stakeholder capitalism comes in and says, no, wait, you've got to serve not just the shareholders, but you need to elevate other stakeholders like customers and employees and the communities in which you operate. The reality is that under shareholder capitalism that we have in the United States, all those stakeholders are taken care of first before the shareholders. So employees get paid. Customers their needs are met. Communities in which companies operate, they have to be good citizens, and so really this is a twisting of the allegiance that a corporation has to its various constituents. And what that ultimately means is when you elevate other parties to the same level as shareholders, you introduce the idea that a corporation's purpose is to serve society. And when you do that, it means that you are now introducing political issues to serve society. And so so each year a company holds an annual meeting. It's called under the shareholder annual meeting season. It's when shareholders get to vote on different issues that are brought to corporations. This last season in the spring of this year, one of the major issues was pushing companies to adopt abortion and force companies to pay for abortions. These are political issues that are typically not, that are not company issues. They may have a policy or choose to cover those kinds of things, but we're seeing activist shareholders pushing issues onto companies. On the environmental side, it's reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and then the reporting turns into forces to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So first they report, and then with that information, the activists come in and say, okay, now you need to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. And this is like for companies like ExxonMobil, whose purpose is to develop energy, and it's not in the best interest of shareholders to reduce their output, energy output, their oil and gas exploration.
Right.
That's how shareholders make money. And so this is clearly anti-shareholder capitalism. It is introducing this idea that we should take political issues out of our political system and push them through the corporation. Most Americans do not want this. It's harmful to all of us when all of our lives we're surrounded by politics. We want to go to business and work together to achieve outcomes that improve society. And we've seen this attack on capitalism and our free enterprise system for decades. It's just that ESG really took it to the next level. And when the Biden administration came in, it was sort of a green light to the activists and to kind of blue state pension systems and large investment managers to push this agenda onto corporate America.
No, and I think you're right. I think it has been brewing under the surface for a while, and many of us didn't really realize it until ESG kind of put a name to what was actually happening. And when they did that, it raised a lot of awareness and set off a lot of red flags, because to me, ESG is the antithesis of free market capitalism. It is government using special interest groups and special interest groups using government to cram down what they want on private companies. And you see it time and again. Again, you mentioned ExxonMobil and those big companies. Yeah, they want them to cut their greenhouse gases by 80% or some arbitrary number. But it is not in that country's interest, or a company's interest, or their shareholders' best interest, because capitalism is driven by the money side of it. This agenda is driven by what somebody wants out of that company or wants that company to do. It is not in the best interest, and is not for the fiduciary to be able to uphold their duties to the people who own shares in those companies, because the people who are buying shares on the market for those companies, they're the ones. They want to make money, and these things that they're implementing are inhibiting that cost. So I know that ESG was at the front of everybody's mind for a while. It was the top of the ticket. It seems to have switched just a little bit. But where are we at with ESG? I mean, you still see it, but it seems like a lot of companies have backed off. Have you noticed the same?
Yes. Although there are still very strong efforts to push companies in this direction. And let me just kind of backtrack a little bit on some of the things you said. Just kind of brought something to mind as we think about our economic system. Our economic system, free enterprise capitalism, or free market capitalism as we know it, has really you and I as consumers at the center of the system. And so companies are trying to meet the demands of the marketplace being you and I and other entities in the marketplace that are looking for goods and services that we want to buy and use our money for. And so it's really a bottom-up kind of system that ensures economic freedom for you and I, so that we can decide how we want to spend our money. ESG comes in, and it's really a top-down system that says companies cannot serve their customers. They need to serve this bigger agenda, whether it's man-made climate change and the Paris Climate Accord, or some other UN agenda, or another political agenda like abortion. And so companies are really caught between trying to deal with activists who are pushing ESG and the customers that are ultimately paying for the goods and services that they want to buy. And so this is where we've seen the tension in the marketplace with things like Anheuser-Busch and other companies that have adopted product strategies, product marketing to serve, for example, the human rights campaign that says, hey, if you want to get a good score for as a company, then you need to implement transgender advertising in your company. And this is completely counter to shareholder capitalism that would say, what is in the best interest of the company and the shareholders. It's not to alienate their customers, it's to provide the best goods and services at the best prices to drive value to the corporation. So hopefully that's helpful to think about as in looking forward and going forward. Where are we at with ESG? We're really seeing different issues being pushed through the annual shareholder meeting. So a couple of years ago it was greenhouse gas emissions. That continues, but there's been a big push on abortion issues lately. The New York comptroller recently sent letters to different companies, like Costco, for example, telling them that they needed to provide abortifacients in all their stores, and that was good for shareholders, for the shareholders. That's the kind of activism that is happening sort of behind the scenes that is very much in line with ESG. It's really taking issues that are political in nature, pulling them out of our political system, or just taking the political issues and adopting them, putting them into our business system and pushing them that way. And it's just, it really breaks down the barriers that we have between all the different verticals, I guess, in our economy.
No, but I think a prime example of this is if you go back, was it last year when Bud Light made their extreme foobar on putting Dylan Mulvaney on one of their cans, and they started pushing that trans agenda out to the public. Yes, this was a decision made by a private company, but you saw how much their market cap lost in a short time. But think of a company that is being, again, that was a personal decision, maybe driven by ESG behind the scenes. I'm not sure. I can't allude to that. But think of a company that is being forced to do things like that, to push that transgender activism, or to push abortion, or the climate agenda, or else. That is the answer. They have to do it or else. But you look at how much was that in the best interest. Look at Anheuser-Busch. Was that in the best interest of Bud Light to do that? Because the billions of dollars they lost, but ESG is forcing that upon people. So I think that's, to me, has been a prime example of what it looks like and what it could do to a company if ESG were implemented, and taking that autonomy away from them to make the best decision for their company and for their shareholders.
Yes, and let me give you another example.
Yeah.
Because this also speaks to where things are headed, hopefully. So earlier this year, some of the larger blue state pension plans like CalPERS and others sent a letter to ExxonMobil saying that they were going to oppose the election of certain directors if they continued to oppose kind of these greenhouse gas emissions and some of this agenda that's being pushed through the shareholder season and this activism. And ExxonMobil decided, they really needed to stand up, and so they sued one of these activist groups that has said, look, we're not really investing to make money in ExxonMobil. We're investing to push an agenda on the company, and our whole purpose is to force ESG, but essentially greenhouse gas reductions on ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil said, hey, that is not in the best interest of the company. We are going to stand up. We are going to sue some of these activist groups to stop them from being able to push this agenda. This is a very important case that's going on right now. And these blue state pensions said, wait, no, if you're going to do that, we are going to recommend that our shares and all the other shares in the marketplace vote against the directors of ExxonMobil and replace them with people who will push this agenda. And so I was part of the State Financial Officers Foundation that sent a letter to ExxonMobil encouraging them to stand up against these activists. And when the votes came in this last session, so normally, or this last season, normally the board at ExxonMobil has received 96% approval, and it's been supported by 96% of the shares of the company. Even with these big pension plans making a huge fuss about this issue, it dropped by 1%, so 95% support for the board. So that was a huge win, and really sent the message that this effort to politicize even a company like ExxonMobil that has been so demonized over the years is not going to gain traction. And in fact, I think we're seeing a reverse from a lot of shareholders saying, you know what, we shouldn't be voting our shares to politicize these companies. So that was a really important step this year.
No, that's an important thing, is to let people understand and let those shareholders vote and elect them. But something that a lot of people don't understand, and you alluded to it in there, was pensions. But some people are like, well, I don't invest in the stock market. I don't own any interest in companies. I have a retirement and a 401k. Why does it matter to me? And that leads us back to BlackRock and State Street. So can you speak a minute to those things, that why people's retirement, what their money's actually being spent for, that they don't actually understand?
Yeah, so in your retirement plan, if you're in a 401k, you have a lineup that you can invest in, different funds that you invest in through your 401k, and those are often index funds. And so the big index providers are Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock. And in the case of State Street and BlackRock, they, and to a lesser extent Vanguard, but they have taken the ownership from individuals across this country that have invested in these funds. They take the ownership of those shares, and they have worked with companies. It's called engagement. They engage with the companies on these political issues and try and get the companies to adopt political policies like reporting on greenhouse gas emissions and then reducing those greenhouse gas emissions. And with food companies, in their supply chains with grocery stores, how much greenhouse gas emissions are you responsible for in your grocery store? And so that's where it touches on agriculture, and I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about that. But what people need to understand is that their shares that they are holding in their 401k are then being used by the manager that is managing those funds, whether it's BlackRock, Vanguard, or State Street, to engage with the companies and to use that passive ownership to actively manage the companies from a political perspective, which is essentially what ESG is. It's pushing political agendas actively, and so it's very perverse. They're supposed to be agents, these investment managers, agents for the investors, and looking after the best interest of the investors and what's in their financial best interest, and that's their fiduciary duty. And so they're using other people's money really to drive political agendas that are not in the best interests of the investors or the country, frankly.
Right. And that, to me, is where I really see the problem with these types of things, is they're knowingly investing other people's money, people's retirements, and those type of things. They are investing your money to basically drive up the cost of your goods and services, the things that you're actually using. And so it never really made much sense to me how people could continue to buy in. But this activism really knows no bounds at this point. It is, to me, no longer a free market system. There are too many external forces that are driving in on it. And that really leads us to the next thing that you've really been fighting on, and that's natural asset resource companies. So what was it, about a year ago? No, we're not even that far out. When did they go to put natural asset resource companies on the stock exchange? I guess first, tell people what a natural asset, and basically in layman's terms, what a natural asset resource company can and does do.
Yeah, so natural asset company, NAC is the three-letter acronym. Natural asset companies were a idea to manage land so that it would not produce economic activity. It would be preserved for ecological services like Mother Nature.
And is this private land or public land? Both.
It could be public or private.
Okay.
And so really the idea is to prevent human activity on the land. And so the natural asset company, the idea was to list those types of companies on the New York Stock Exchange. And then those companies could raise money from investors around the world, including from China and Russia. Anybody that could invest in the United States could invest in a natural asset company. And then that money would be used to secure management rights, not the land itself, but management rights to land, to manage it for maximizing ecological services, things like clean air and soil composition, and things that are very important. The problem when you do that is that once you start managing those kinds of things, then you have ownership of the management, and you turn what we think of as positive externalities or public goods, things that all of us depend on but don't pay for. You turn them into commodities that could be charged to people. So if you're going to breathe air, right, how much is it going to cost you to do that? That's the door, the Pandora's box that is opened through that kind of mechanism. And so what we're seeing is a desire to manage land in this country for ecological purposes, which essentially means to stop human activity on land.
Yeah. So what they did in layman's terms to me, and the way that I read into that, is they give ownership of certain things such as carbon sequestration, air pollution, clean air, dark skies, all of those things. They turn them into something that you could tangibly own and that somebody could invest in. Somebody then invests in that, say a group of activists, again, because that seems to be the common theme throughout all of this, is the activists invest into, say, the carbon sequestration of this and say, hey, cows are bad for this, which in fact they aren't, but they can make up their own rules. They say cows are bad for this, sheep are bad for this, so we're going to stop grazing, and you can't graze on your own land because we now own the ability to say, hey, that's bad for the environment, you can't do that. Am I wrong?
Yeah, that's right. Especially in Utah, where, with grazing, I think over 70% of land that is used for grazing is federally owned land. Yeah. And so that's, if it's your own land, then it's a little bit harder for them to control that. But when it's you getting a license essentially to graze on federal land, then they can prevent you from getting that license if they believe that the grazing is a bad activity. And
that's what it is. And Utah's dead center for these types of initiatives. Everything west of the Mississippi really is, because of the high ownership of federal government has in each state. 67% of the state of Utah is owned by the federal government. And when you talk about grazing and agriculture, most parts of that are done on public lands here in Utah, but we have to be able to continue to manage those lands. We have to have the autonomy to manage those lands how we best see fit. Now, the best management practices for those are the most important, and we shouldn't have companies that are telling us how to do that. But you look at these, and you look at the 30 by 30 initiative, which is to take out of production 30% of ground in not just in the United States, but across the globe by 2030. They don't want us to use those. But how are we going to continue to feed? This is a question I ask people. You take 30%, we as in the United States right now, as of 2019, we became a net importer of food, and agriculture to me makes the most sense to talk about this because that's really what's under attack. So now we're a net importer of food here in the United States. As we're barely meeting demands, and we're honestly not anymore. So you take 30% of land out of production. This is private and public land. These are land management that they're using. These are conservation easements that the government is using to take these out of production. It was a big push for these natural asset companies to take these out of production. But what happens when we take 30% of land out of production now? We don't have the ability to feed our country anymore. And you're going to start seeing people go hungry. And I hate to sound like a doomsday person, but these are things that I truly worry about. And that really leads us to what happened with those. So tell folks who didn't watch this up close and personal like we did, what happened with the stock exchange, because these were going on the floor to be traded. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, that's right. And basically the New York Stock Exchange needed a rule from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the regulator of markets, to allow them to list this kind of company, because the accounting wasn't based on our traditional economic accounting, because ecological services, the value of clean air and pollination, things like that, we don't have economic values for those, and so they would be based on UN accounting rules, and so that creates its own set of serious problems, because you're talking about arbitrary valuations for these positive public goods essentially. And so the New York Stock Exchange had to get a rule that would allow them to list this kind of company, because the accounting isn't anything that we've contemplated in the United States before.
Because there's no real way to quantify it, right?
That's right.
I mean, that to me is the problem. There's no way to quantify
exactly
what that asset is worth.
That's right. It's not objective accounting, economic accounting. So, and so there was a comment period, a couple of different comment periods, a lot of uproar across the country saying this is nuts. Nobody wants this. And ultimately, the company that owns the New York Stock Exchange realized that this would create a problem for public access, things like hunting and fishing, and things that we think of as
agriculture,
as outdoor recreation, and agriculture, all sorts of things that this could have a negative effect on. And so they pulled the rule request from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and that killed the natural asset companies. So that that was a good thing. And the other thing that I think is important to point out, and this is just recently here in Utah, a very positive step was the lawsuit that was put forward to the Supreme Court. Governor Cox and Attorney General Sean Reyes to get some of this public land back. I mean, a significant amount of land back in Utah.
Yes.
That's a huge positive step forward that we've never seen that before, and so I just applaud our the executive branch here for their efforts in moving this issue forward, because it's a critical point now where we are seeing the weaponization of land management to the detriment of the country, and in our state it's an acute issue because of the amount of land that is managed and owned by the federal government.
No, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. As everybody who knows me knows that Governor Cox and I don't agree on a lot of things, and we have vehemently had arguments in the past. But in this instance, absolutely kudos, because this is something that I believe has been a long time coming, and it's time we have the fight, because when we're so dependent on the federal government, and when they have so much power and control over people's economic livelihood here in the state, whether that's mining, drilling, energy extraction of any kind, agriculture, these things solely rely on the land. And when you look at anything in this world that really is of value, of tangible value, it comes out of the ground. It's either grown, it's drilled for, it's cut, it's milled, all of those things But when you lock people off of that ground, when you lock them off of their ability to grow their economy and to create economic freedom, you put them in a cage. And I've always seen the federal government owning this much land west of the Mississippi as that. And again, kudos to them and this effort. They have my full support in it, because this is something that absolutely has to happen, and it has been a long time coming.
Yeah. And by the way, a
Yeah.
lot of this activity is happening in rural communities. So huge shout out to rural Utah and rural communities across this country. It's those areas that are extracting the minerals and growing the farms and the food that we need and grazing the animals. This doesn't happen in urban areas. This is out in rural America, where a lot of this land is under attack.
Yeah, and it's part of what has really gutted a lot of rural America. I mean, you look at our town in particular here, that you have a couple options. You either work at the school, you work at the coal mine, or you farm. I mean, that really is your options. And so when you look at two of those things depend directly on this, the other one depends indirectly on this. And so without the mines and without the drilling and the oil in these small rural communities, not just in Utah, but across the country, how much they depend on their ability to have access to that land. I mean, the Northwest, you've got the timber, you've got Texas and North Dakota, that is such a big oil communities. And I mean, they depend solely on that. And so this is very important. And some folks in the population centers may not see that, but their lives directly rely on it. And 3 times a day when they eat, they do. When they go to the gas station and fill up their car, they do. They depend on it. And so it's really this advocacy. And this is why I believe that you and I do what we do, is to spread this word and to let other people understand that this is going to affect them at some point. And again, to your credit, you have led the charge on multiple fronts across the country, first with ESG and then with the NACs, and to be able to raise that public awareness and shut them down. And that doesn't happen very often. And again, you're my friend, but I truly commend you on a professional level for a lot of the things that you've accomplished along those lines.
Well, it's been a group effort, I'll say that. There's no way you can do this kind of thing alone. I just appreciate all the support from others, both within the state and across the country, because this is an agenda that is global in nature, and we've seen it, in Europe with farmers, protesting there, and I mean it impacts all of humanity, and at the end of the day, the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to reduce the population, and so.
Right.
This impacts everybody.
Yeah, I'm with you. But to a bigger point too, for me, this agenda is all about control, and they'll do it through whatever means they want, and they want to control. I mean, you look at agriculture right now. I've talked about this before, but in this omnibus spending bill this last time around, there was $15 million allocated, and I want people to pay attention to this. In an omnibus bill, in a spending bill, there was an allocation of $15 million, and that was for mandatory RFID tags in cattle in the United States. And for people who don't know what those are, RFID tags are a small tag that's put in the cow's ear that is able to be scanned by an electronic device to be able to tell whose cow that is, where that cow's been, who that cow belongs to. But what this rule did was this rule made it so that it was mandatory and that the government had access to it. I'm not against RFID tags. I'm just going to say that. I think on everybody's operation, they can do what they please, and this is America. So to you, do what you want. But when government gets that control, I mean, you look at what's happening in Europe. They tag those animals when they're born. The government has the ability to track those animals throughout their life, who they are. But with your carbon goals, if you're not meeting your carbon goals, guess what? You lose access to the market. You're not allowed that. You send an animal to the market, they scan that tag and say it belongs to you. Well, it pops up on the computer. Hey, they didn't meet their carbon goals. They didn't eliminate half of their herd. Their animal is not legally available for sale. So kick it out and send it back. And this is happening.
Crazy,
People are like,
but
oh,
it's
right.
absolutely, we're talking about what gets measured gets managed. And that's
Yeah.
really the idea behind all of this. With land, if you can measure the carbon footprint of land or the carbon footprint of animals or whatever it is, then you can try to manage it to the level that is acceptable, whatever that is. And so it's really this push to measure everything so that it can be managed. And
Yeah. Well, with RFID, they always say it's measure, monitor, verify, and then mandate. They want to measure what you have. They want to monitor what you're doing with it. They want to verify that they have all the information, and they want to manage you how they want to manage you. And to me, that's anti-American. I mean, ESG.
Well, you lose your freedom at that point.
Yeah, you really do. And it's not far-fetched. And people say, oh, that'll never happen. They'll never. No, they are saying the quiet part out loud. They are literally showing us what they are going to do. ESG.
Well, Europe is a great example.
Europe, look at them.
Yeah, I mean, they had some farmers where they said you have to cull 95% of your herd in the Netherlands.
Yeah,
and so that's not outlandish at all. The whole climate agenda is really the pretext for tyranny and controlling human activity and what we can and cannot eat and all sorts of repercussions.
But I mean, that is the root of our country. That's the root of our freedom, is the ability to self-determine and to be able to make these decisions for yourself. And that free market capitalism that has unleashed what we have been in the past as Americans. And if people can't get their way, what they want, they go to the government now, and they use big daddy government to crack down on people who won't agree with them. And that's where we run into these issues. That's why you're starting to see this huge push, is because people want something. They want to manage, or they want control, and they think that they have the right answers in every sector. And I always come back to the climate issue. I say, okay, you want to have this discussion, let's have this discussion, because if you want to have the actual talk about where agriculture is in the climate process, we will, because at the end of the day, there has been one industry that has shown to be net zero in carbon emissions, and that's agriculture. That we take and sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere than we produce. And we are one of the only industries that does. But when the first thing people want to talk about when they talk about carbon emissions, they want to talk about cows. They want to talk about livestock. They want to talk about how farmers and ranchers are ruining the country, ruining the environment, killing our planet. But yet that's not what the science shows. That's not what whose science are we following? Because that's not what shows. And so that's why I think it's imperative that we keep doing what we're doing, and we keep fighting back against that. But on a national level, too, another thing that I see as a huge problem coming up is the national debt and what we're spending. I know you've been involved a little bit on that. I know you've been helping with an effort to kind of put forward a plan to mitigate that. So you look at the national debt, we're what, $35 trillion in debt at this point. Our interest payments are about to become the biggest expenditure of the federal government. It's a huge problem to tackle, and so many people, it's becoming a worry for them. Where do you see us going? How does this affect Utah families? I mean, some people are like, oh, it's just a national debt, but how does this affect Utahns? How does this affect everybody across the country, not just Utahns in their own individual states? Where do we start, and how can we make a difference?
It's a really important question. So we have, as you mentioned, over 35 trillion in debt. The problem is that about a third of that needs to be replaced every year because it tends to be borrowed short term. Even though we do have 30-year treasury bonds, on average about a third of that 35 trillion comes due. So we're trying to roll over about 12 trillion. And when you're replacing low interest debt with higher interest debt, and we've had higher interest rates, particularly on the short end of the curve. So T-bills are about 5% yields. When you replace almost 0% coupon with a 5% coupon on those treasuries, you're adding a significant amount to the interest obligation of the federal government. So how much money of the budget needs to go to pay off investors who invest in these bonds. And so more of our budget dollars are going to service the debt than can go to things in the economy or things that we need. And so the problem is that then if we don't have enough money from receipts, then we need to borrow money to pay those who have lent money to the government. So we're borrowing to pay back our investors, and you get into something called a debt spiral, where you're borrowing just to pay off investors, and your debt begins to spiral out of control, and so that it becomes more money is funneled to servicing the debt. And so essentially what happens then is that the government can address that by cutting down on spending, but there really hasn't been any appetite to cut down on spending. So the other alternative is
we haven't seen that curbed yet, have we?
No. The other alternative is to inflate the economy and inflate our way out of the debt, and so that's where all of us are being impacted is the amount of inflation that we're seeing. Since 2020, early 2020, we've seen 25% inflation over those 4 years or 5 years almost. And so that's basically, we've been robbed of 25% of our earnings over that time period. And so it's hitting all of us, and it becomes more of a problem as time goes on and interest rates go up. We reissue debt. Now, if interest rates go down, that could lead to inflation as well, because the economy becomes stronger and there's more money circulating in the economy, and that money circulating in the economy pushes prices up, basically, because of the amount of more money being in the economy.
Sure.
So
I akin it to the country has a credit card, and the credit card's about maxed out. So they go and get a different credit card and use that credit card to pay off the old one. And
that's right.
That's the spiral we're in as the country right now. And every time they uptick in the current situation that we're in, every time they pick up a new credit card, well, the interest rate is higher on that. So now you're owing more and more money on every time. So that's with the T-bills and the Treasury and what's happening in inflation, and people see it, people feel it, and it's impacting. I mean, we were going through our finances the other day, and I was looking at it, and it's costing us between $1,500 and $1,800 a month more now to live than it was 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And I mean, shameless plug for President Trump here at this point. It's like, hey, we got to get a handle on this, because we're in a tight spot, and a lot depends on it and a lot rides on it. But at the end of the day, you watch everything on the financial side in the state, not just in the state, but on a national level, you see things coming down the pipe before we do. What do you see next? What do you think that people should be watching out for? And how can they best impact what's going forward? I mean, we can start with the federal government. How do we get a handle on what they're doing first, and what should be that approach? And then how can individuals help and make a difference going forward?
Yeah, it's, we're facing unprecedented challenges. And I think that's why states are so important, is because states can push back and do things that Congress can't do. And so that's why a position like a state treasurer is so important, as state auditor or, attorney general, governor. All of these positions are so important at the state level, and legislators critical, of course, because we as a state can do things that could never happen in Washington, D.C. And so some of the things that not just Utah is looking at, but other states are looking at, is how can we protect ourselves as citizens from the decline in the dollar, purchasing power of the dollar. So, how do we protect ourselves in an inflationary environment? And so looking at things like transactional gold, or transactional precious metals. A lot of states are looking at that. We, back in 2011, passed the first Species Legal Tender Act, and other states are very seriously looking at that kind of legislation that does away with taxes, certainly at the state level, on precious metals transactions. And then, is there a way to allow citizens to use their money to buy gold and transact in the economy so that their purchasing power is retained? So that's something that's kind of interesting, that as a state, we might be able to help facilitate that sort of thing.
Yeah. What about backing? I know we've talked about this before, and the conversation's been had at the state level. What about precious metals for the state's holdings? Things like that. Have you ever looked into that? What do you think the future of precious metals and actually something to back up our currency on a state level looks like?
Yeah, so really at the state level, we, this last legislative session, Representative Ivory, he had a gold bill that the legislature passed and the governor signed that gives the treasurer the ability to purchase up to 10% of precious metals for the rainy day funds. And so in our state, we have about 1.4 billion in rainy day funds. And so that bill would allow me to purchase up to 10% in the precious metals for the rainy day funds. So that's one place where it could make sense that we really, as a way to protect ourselves against inflation, in the rainy day funds, we could make that purchase. So other portfolios are able to invest in any kind of security. It's a longer term portfolios in particular. The Public Treasures Investment Fund, that's the $34 billion fund that we manage in our office. That's more of a short-term money market fund. And because gold tends to be quite volatile, it can go down quite a bit. It could negatively impact that fund. So we have not chosen to pursue, volatile assets in that fund. But it's certainly, things that we're looking at that we haven't traditionally looked at in the past, but we also have never as a country been this much in debt and seeing this amount of inflation because of that.
We've never seen markets like this in my lifetime, but even beyond. I mean, you look at the mortgage market right now. I mean, talking to a friend of mine who's in the mortgage brokerage, he says, I mean, the rates are adjusting by the day by swings of a full point. I mean, we have never seen markets this volatile. I mean, in the morning, he says it can be at 5.8, and by midday, it's at 6.5. And by the time it closes, we're pushing on 7. And those used to be, I mean, but the markets are extremely volatile, like you talk, and I think all of them are. But if you were given, if I look at it like this, you're probably one of the wisest guys who knows what's happening in the markets, and you see it from 30,000 feet, where the rest of us just kind of look up at it. But if you were giving advice to your children or your family on how to protect themselves, or how to, and this is not investment advice, but just sound advice on maybe what's coming and what you think they could do to protect themselves in the future.
Yeah, no, it's, think about that almost every day. It seems like these days, just some of the things that we're trying to be more conscientious about is how do we spend our dollars, like with agriculture, trying to go directly to the producers. So we recently purchased, meat and went directly to a producer of meat instead of the grocery store. So you get a better quality product. You're helping the farmers to retain more of the economic value of what they raise, so it keeps them in business. Those are the kinds of things that I think are really important for us to think about, is how do we help our neighbors who are the agricultural producers.
And you and I have been on part of this. I mean, you and I have been a part of a few of the Save Our Ranchers things and the Crofter Market. We've spoken at a few of those events, and I think that's some sound advice for everybody is to buy local. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to make that note between you and I because we've had that in common.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to think about how they're purchasing and who they're purchasing from and who is it ultimately supporting. And because we are seeing this economic stress, particularly the agriculture, I'm very concerned about agriculture in this country, and I want to make sure that
you and me both.
Yeah, that we have the producers that can produce what we're going to need as society, and so I want to help them as much as I can. And then, beyond that, just kind of thinking through what are things that you need on hand for whatever may come along. Who knows? I know a lot of people are purchasing gold, and there are platforms like Glint, Glint. That's not the only one, but it's one that I'm familiar with. There's the Alpine Gold Exchange in Utah that helps people get precious metals. There's other precious metals dealers in the state, and I'm not recommending.
I've seen a bunch of them,
endorsing anybody, but I'm just simply saying that that's something that a lot of people are thinking about, looking at,
or hedging with.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you just kind of have to think through some of these things and figure out what makes sense for you.
Yeah, no, and I think that's pretty sound advice. But again, I can't stress enough how much that you have done and how many things are moving, how many shifting pieces, but rely on these financial markets and what's happening and what's coming. Any closing thoughts on ESG or NACs or anything that you may see coming or think that people should be focusing on?
Yeah, I think land issues are going to be picking up here.
Conservation easements.
And conservation easements, right? All these kinds of things that people should understand and become aware of. And I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will hand over the millions of acres of land that would really help us as a state. So that's something to keep an eye on, and I think it's important for people to understand where their money is invested, how it's invested, letting companies, the 401k providers, the service providers, whether it's the Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, letting them know that you do not want your money politicized. You do not want them engaging with companies to try and change them for political purposes or, to push agendas like ESG, that you expect them to uphold the fiduciary standard that ultimately benefits you as a retirement investor. So, when you're doing business with companies, make sure that you understand how that company is operating and that they represent the values that you find important and that are willing to uphold free enterprise capitalism, because that's ultimately our economic freedoms that are at stake. And so if you stop doing business with a company, don't just stop doing business with them. Let them know why you are not doing business with them and why you refuse to do business with them. Conversely, if there are companies that are doing the right thing and you appreciate what they're doing, let them know that you appreciate that, and so that they hear from the consumers that we appreciate their staying apolitical and out of the fray and just trying to provide the best goods and services to the marketplace. Those
no, but we've seen how it moves. I mean, we've seen how the consumer can move these corporations or whatever it be in the right direction. And I mean, that is the beauty of free market capitalism, is that they can move freely and that they can make adjustments depending on what the market and what the consumer is calling for. And I think that's a key point. And I think that brings us back full circle to where we started, is that this free market capitalism and this ability to move freely and this freedom of commerce, that is what has made our country as good as it is. And it has what has driven it and it's what's going to drive us into the future. To you, I commend you on your fight. I appreciate your friendship and I look forward to fighting this fight with you in the future. So thanks again, Marlo, for joining me here today and spreading the good word.
Thank you, Carson. It's great to be with you.